Dr. Linda Langford, an Evaluation and Communication Scientist with the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, and Dr. April Foreman, who serves as the Suicide Prevention Coordinator at Southeast Louisiana Veterans Healthcare. Let me also take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Kim, and I serve as the Associate Director for Communications for the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. I will be helping to facilitate today's conversation, as will my colleague Avery.
Hello all, my name is Avery Bellew. I'm the National Partnerships Associate with the Action Alliance. We're so happy that so many folks can join this webinar today. Thanks so much for being here.
So before we get started, I want to give you a glimpse of what we'll be covering over the next 90 minutes. We'd like to provide you with an overview of the Action Alliance's Changing the Conversation priority, discuss our framework for successful messaging and how it applies to you, highlight why you are all key to helping to change the national conversation, give you some details about our shared plan for Suicide Prevention Month, and finally, and most importantly, have a robust discussion by hearing from all of you. We encourage you to ask questions, share with others on today's webinar your messaging strategies or challenges, and again, chat throughout today's webinar by using the chat function, which many of you have already been doing so. So we'd like to get a better sense as to who is joining us today. We're asking you to please check which of the following roles most appropriately applies to you. Simply use the poll feature you'll see on the screen here and check the most appropriate box.
We see folks are checking the various boxes here. Thus far, it looks like we have a good amount of folks who work in public health and suicide prevention at the state level. Like there's a lot of you represented. Quite a few folks who work at the national level as well in public health or suicide prevention. Thus far, about 17 of you on the call. Thank you so much for being here. A good amount of you are mental health professionals, and of course there may be some overlap there with some of these other categories too, but about 51 of you on the call thus far. That's great to see. And a lot of folks, Kim, in education. So we have quite a few folks here from K through 12 and also higher education. So both of those are looped together. And I saw that too in the comments, quite a few folks calling in from various universities across the country. So we're really excited to have you here. And then a good number of folks too from just other community-based settings. So looks like we have a large number of folks who are choosing that as an option also. So it's really exciting to see this diversity of where you all are coming from. And I think, you know, Kim, one of the things I'm reflecting on as we start this webinar is that really there will be something in this webinar for all of these folks calling in from all of these different settings. So it's really exciting to see that we do have a lot of diversity here, and hopefully there'll be really great takeaways for everyone, you know, no matter what setting they might be in.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating, and we'll have another poll throughout. So again, we encourage your participation, and more importantly, we encourage your dialogue throughout. And you can do so by chatting using the chat function that you see on your screen on the left side. Okay. A lot of people calling in. It looks like a lot of mental health professionals.
And a few folks in the chat, Kim, just mentioning too that about that poll that a lot of them do have overlapping roles. So thanks for acknowledging that. Obviously, we have some kind of categories there, and we realize a lot of you have, you know, you actually wear more than one hat. So thanks for bringing that to our attention as well.
Yep. Okay, I want to give you an overview of the Action Alliance's Changing the Conversation priority. We have three main priorities, and one of them, as I mentioned, is focused on changing the national narrative about suicide and suicide prevention to ones that promote hope, resiliency, connectedness, and recovery. This priority is focused on fundamentally transforming attitudes and behaviors relating to suicide. Now, you may be asking yourself, how exactly do we change the conversation? The Action Alliance is doing so by reaching, equipping, and engaging key communication influencers, which include news reporters, the entertainment industry, and suicide prevention messengers. These three key audiences typically interact with and reflect messaging from each other, both reinforcing and challenging public narratives about important public health issues like suicide. Today's webinar really focuses on the third audience, suicide prevention messengers. So you notice during the poll there are a variety of individuals from various settings on today's call. But regardless of your role or where you are, we all have one thing in common. We all serve as suicide prevention messengers and want to communicate about suicide prevention in the most effective way possible. This webinar is about you. You play an important role in changing the national conversation. Media can also play a role in educating the public about suicide and suicide prevention. To ensure accurate and safe coverage that encourages help seeking, we urge media to use best practices as found in the recommendations for reporting on suicide. Many of you likely interact with reporters on a daily or regular basis. So we encourage you as suicide prevention messengers to reinforce to reporters that they use the recommendations, which they can access by going to reportingonsuicide.org as shown on the screen, and we'll also be typing it in the chat function. The rest of this webinar will focus on information that you directly disseminate to the public, or what we're calling public messaging. So when we think of public messaging, we maybe think of campaigns like posters or public service announcements, and that's definitely part of public messaging. But there's a lot of other materials and methods that we use to share information with the public, such as maybe event announcements or newsletters. If I ask you, feel free to chime in using that chat function, all the ways you communicate to the public, and maybe all the channels you use to disseminate your messaging. And I'm sure we're going to get chats such as websites and maybe social media channels like Facebook and Twitter and others. So again, let us know some of the other ways you're communicating to the public. We'll be sharing those answers. Important to note that the public does not include some other types of communication that relate to suicide, including public conversations, doctor-patient interactions, and as some of these others that are listed on the slide here. While these types of communications are important, they are not the focus of today's discussion.
So, Kim, just a quick note to say we have folks mentioning a few different ways that they feel they use to message about suicide. So folks have mentioned social media, which I think is important. There's some folks mentioning Facebook, and I know we'll be talking about that. I see folks mentioning listservs, so maybe distributing content there, and some folks thinking about media, so through their local cable station, and there's quite a few folks talking about Facebook. So it looks like a good variety here, Twitter, and then workshops. So folks are mentioning that too. So it looks like a lot of different ways of communicating, hopefully a lot of which we'll address today. So now, thanks for folks who've shared kind of the ways that you've messaged. We want to take a moment now just to ask the question and get your input about why you think messaging is important. We talked a little bit about what it is, how we're defining it, and who public messengers are, which are all of you really on this call. So many of you are in that role of public messaging. So just for a few moments, use the chat section to share with us why you think messaging is so important, and this conversation about messaging is important to suicide prevention. And we'll share your responses here.
And I see one response saying that messaging is so important because it could help an individual in crisis or an individual that's struggling and connect them to services. It's a great point.
Right. So a few folks are sharing that. A lot of folks are talking about its role in removing stigma, so that messaging correctly is important for reducing stigma. Quite a few responses talking about stigma, which is really interesting. Raising awareness, So just folks kind of knowing and understanding that there are ways that people can help someone who is thinking about suicide, which is great, so the awareness piece there. And there are some folks who are turning our attention to the way things are messaged, which is really great. So I think in some of the responses, we're seeing that folks understand that some ways that we message can educate the public about suicide in a productive way, and yet there are other types of message that might undermine our desire to prevent suicide. And so it looks like a few folks understand that that nuance is present, that some types of messaging maybe are harmful and other types are helpful. So it's really good to see some folks already have that understanding as we move forward with the content.
That's a great point. Yes, because you're right. There are some type of messaging that could potentially increase risk among vulnerable individuals. That's what I actually want to address next. The Action Alliance Task Force that created the resource that we'll be sharing later today identified the need for a change in public messaging. They found that public messaging about suicide often focused more on describing the problem than on conveying concrete action steps or solutions. It sometimes violated safety recommendations, it didn't follow principles of effective health communications, and would be more effective if they were part of a broader integrated strategic plan where communication complements and supports programmatic efforts. Here on this slide are a few examples of less effective public messaging. However, we want to spend our time today talking about how messaging can be most effective. So based on some expert panel conclusions, it was identified that the focus on problem severity was collectively helping to create an overall negative narrative about suicide, often saying that it's hopeless and that nothing can be done about it, that we needed to focus more of our prevention messages about hope and recovery and resilience. Now, we don't deny the problem and that all stories are very important, but at the same time, we were missing an opportunity to share the many real stories of coping and resiliency that exist. And finally, they noted that our messaging often is reactive, and we could do more proactive in helping to shape the conversation. That doesn't mean that we adopt a one-size-fits-all message, because no one message will work for every organization or for every audience, but we can create a common framework that we can use to help create effective messages that aligns our work and collectively helps to change the conversation.
So as we go into this section, Kim just mentioned that a tool that we'll be discussing is the framework for successful messaging. We'd like to open a poll to ask this question: have you used the framework for successful messaging? If we could open that poll now. You can see that come up in just a moment. So the results there are your answers are yes, you've used it regularly, yes, but infrequently, no, you haven't used it, or you're unsure if you've used it, which is a valid answer too. I know we all have a lot of resources that we can put our fingers on, so maybe you're not sure if you've used it. So please go ahead and select an option there. And it looks like, Kim, that we have a good amount of folks who have used it regularly, other folks who have used it but not that frequently, and a good number of you who have not used it at all. I think it looks like that and also unsure are a little over half, probably the majority actually of folks now, as folks are continuing to select an option. So I think what's really helpful about you all sharing that, I think for folks who have used it regularly, I think that some of the content for today is going to be very helpful to you in hopefully understanding some additional ways that you can use it, especially when we think about focusing and collaborating in September for suicide prevention. I think that that's going to be really helpful to you. For folks who use it infrequently, we hope that maybe you will learn a few more things about the framework that will help you to see how you can utilize it even more in your work. For folks who have never used it, we're really excited that you're on the call. So we hope this is going to be a great introduction to the framework, and hopefully you'll come away from this call really excited to use it and understanding how you can use it to be more effective in your messaging. And for folks that are unsure, hopefully there'll be some clarity about what the framework is and how it really connects to the work that you're trying to do as a practical tool. So we're really, really glad that all of you are on the call, and I think there'll be something in the rest of this presentation for all of you.
All right. And to give you more information about the framework, I'd like to now pass it over to Mark.
Hi there. Thank you very much for having me participate in today's webinar. And that poll that we just saw, I think, is incredibly helpful and informative. You know, one of the things as we talk about strategies and messaging is, measuring the impact. And so that's a quick little data shot at, what is our reach and what is the impact of the framework. And as we continue with our efforts to share information about the framework with the suicide prevention community and others, we certainly hope to see those numbers in terms of people who are unsure or haven't used move into the category of yes and yes more frequently used. So really appreciate your sharing that information with us. And then the other part of that is, and we'll get onto it, is we're always open to feedback on the framework as well. This is something that will continue to evolve as we learn more about suicide prevention and suicide prevention messaging. So diving into the topic here, so the framework, as you can see, outlines 4 critical issues to consider when developing message about suicide for the public. That's thinking through a clear messaging strategy, following the recommendations for creating messaging that is safe and supports a prevention goal, helping to promote a positive narrative about suicide prevention, and then following any applicable guidelines. In the next several slides, we're going to talk about these elements in a little more detail. You'll notice that the strategy is at the center of the framework, and that is intentional. Strategy is your starting point for any communications effort. It involves upfront thinking, planning, focusing messages so that they're as effective as possible. Thinking strategically helps you create messages that fit your situation and use the limited resources we all have wisely. I'm going to spend a little more time on this element because it's really important in terms of creating more successful messages. So one of the things we start with is there's no one single best suicide prevention message that works for everyone. It's very tempting to jump directly into writing messages or deciding that you're going to deliver a message and we should make a poster. But we really need to step back and for better results, start with the why. Think about why you're messaging, who you want to reach, and what you want the audience to do. Then get to the how you'll reach them. Again, I always say it's all about the audience. It's all about knowing who your audience is, how big that audience is, and again, what you're going to do to reach them. And then you've got to think through your messaging and then make sure it fits in with your other efforts. As you heard earlier, messaging as part of an overall programmatic effort really helps build a suite of services, information, and builds on a more effective strategy. So we bring in the many different strategies, the stakeholders, and again, each of you are already doing great work, and your organizations have an important mission and goal that you're pursuing and audiences that you reach. And there are probably existing programs and services that your institution or community already have in place. So the goal here is to integrate into your overall plan, using it to support and advance other programmatic efforts is a great way to build on the great work that you're already doing. So being strategic includes being guided by what we know about more effective messaging from the general health communications literature and measuring impact. These principles include planning messages systematically, integrating communications into an overall suicide prevention plan, using audience research, engagement, and pre-testing, meaning learning about your audience and getting feedback on messages and materials, just like I asked you all as you're looking at the framework. We'd love to hear your feedback. And this is especially important because there may be messages that we think make perfect sense but might not resonate with the audience you're trying to reach. It's also important to involve people with lived experiences in both the initial planning and reviewing messages along the way, so we avoid creating messages that are problematic or unhelpful down the road. Communications will be more effective if they have specific objectives, a defined audience, and a clear call to action about what we want the audience to do after seeing our messages. Messages that target everyone, or the general public, are usually very ineffective. Better messages are targeted based on specific audiences, what we know about their knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, so we meet the audience where they are at. Audience preferences should also influence what delivery channels and materials you choose. These preferences can change, so it's good to check out assumptions about how people get information, their social media preferences, and where they might likely be to take action. And as we continue to look at the rest of the framework, you'll notice that these strategic principles are woven throughout all the other elements as well. So one of the elements that we talked about, again, is systemic planning. The planning diagram as shown on this slide includes key planning steps to think through as you plot out your communications work. They serve as a checklist of many of the principles, so it's best to answer all the questions before actually creating the messages. In short, set the context. This includes assessing the current situation, including who you have as a messenger, what goals you're already working on, what other programmatic efforts exist, and other factors that will shape the focus of your messaging. Then ask why. What are your communications objectives, and how will that help advance your overall effort? The who question is identifying the audience. Who do you want to reach with the message? The to-do what question is specifying the actions you want this audience to take. It's a critical step that sometimes we forget. What to say is the framing and the message content. Then you can decide channels, how to reach this audience with this message in the most efficient and effective way. The so what is making a plan for how you'll assess whether the messages are reaching the intended audience and what impact they're having. Again, measuring impact is critically important. If what you're doing is not having an impact, you don't want to continue to do it. But if you can see that you are having an impact, then you can, again, continue to improve and refine your messages. But going back to not having an impact, don't want to waste precious resources on something that's not changing attitudes, behaviors, but you want to celebrate that you know you're not having an impact because that just tells you you need to adjust your messages and try reframing again. For some messages, I'll go back to, in like campaigns, you can probably use a more formal planning process to work through all these steps. But they're also good questions to run through as a checklist every time you disseminate information to the public. Again, how you're going to reach them and why and what you want them to be doing. No message should be disseminated to the public without thinking about the why, who, what, and how of it. The safety or safe messaging component of the framework focuses on avoiding messaging content that is potentially harmful or counterproductive. Research on the news media has found that certain types of messaging about suicide may increase the likelihood that individuals who are already vulnerable will consider or attempt suicide. This led to a list of recommended do's or don'ts and do's that we asked journalists to follow, and we feel it's important for messengers to follow those same recommendations. Messages may also be problematic because they're counterproductive to prevention goals, for example, by reinforcing negative stereotypes about people in distress, portraying suicide as a typical response to adversity, or inadvertently suggesting taking action won't help. For example, if your call to action asks the audience to see a doctor, it probably won't help to include the statistics in the same message about how few doctors are trained to respond appropriately to suicidal thoughts. If the doctors in your area aren't actually trained, it might make sense for you to have it part of your overall strategy to include clinician training or other preparation prior to launching your messages. This slide shows practices to avoid because they can be unsafe, by increasing risk for vulnerable individuals or unhelpful by reinforcing problematic norms, conveying negative stereotypes, or otherwise undermining prevention. So as we go through this quite quickly here, it's like don't show or describe suicide methods or locations. Pictures or detailed descriptions of how or where a person died by suicide can encourage imitation or serve as how-to guide. Sharing personal details about an individual who died by suicide may also encourage vulnerable individuals to identify with the person. Don't glorify or romanticize suicide. Portraying suicide as heroic, romantic, or honorable act may actually encourage vulnerable people to view it more positively. Don't normalize suicide behavior by presenting it as common or as acceptable. There's a large body of literature about other health and safety problems documenting the effect of social norms on behavior, meaning what we perceive is typical behavior in certain situations or behavior that others will approve of. This research suggests the potential harm of portraying suicide behavior as common or acceptable response to adversity. For example, if a message makes it seem like most youth who are bullied attempt suicide, then youth may think that suicide is the only way to make the pain stop. The vast majority of people who face adversity, mental illnesses, and other challenges, even those in high-risk groups, do not die by suicide, but instead find support, treatment, and other ways to manage their illness or cope. That said, I really need to clarify a key point here. We must be careful to avoid prejudice and discrimination, blaming those who attempt or die by suicide. Avoiding messages that convey unhealthy norms does not mean that we should use words like abnormal or other negative language to describe people who feel suicidal. Safety means avoiding all language or images that reinforce negative stereotypes about people in distress or otherwise undermine prevention messages. So you can find tips about what to do on the framework website, which is something we're going to be talking a little bit more about. So we've gone through all the don'ts. Part of the important part of this message is the things that we can do, and those are listed again on the framework website, suicidepreventionmessaging.org. So how to go about positive narrative. And that means ensuring that the collective voice of the field is promoting the positive in forms of actions, solutions, successes, resources, programs, or anything else that conveys what prevention can look like. It's expanding our focus from messaging only about suicide to make sure we're also messaging about suicide prevention. As we described earlier, past messaging conveyed mostly negative narratives about suicide. For example, suicidal thoughts inevitably lead to death, or that nothing can be done to address the problem. It includes countering or balancing the negative narrative and helping the public to better envision what prevention can look like. Positive narrative does not mean hiding the tragedy of suicide, not discussing people who have died by suicide, or not talking about suicide as a problem. Superficial changes, like just putting the word hope on posters or using only happy images like kittens or rainbows, is not what we're talking about here. It's thinking in a deep way about the overall story we're telling as a field and how each message can help reframe the overall narrative. Your approach to conveying a positive narrative should fit within your strategy. Based on your communications goals, your audience, call to action, ask, how might our message convey concrete messages of hope, resilience, recovery, action, or prevention successes? What version of a positive narrative might help lead to the change we want? Some examples are shown here, concrete and realistic actions that a particular audience can take to contribute to suicide prevention, along with information needed to act, such as detailed guidance, warning sign, web links, phone numbers. Personal stories of coping, resilience, and recovery. Now, these types of stories can also help reduce prejudice and discrimination. Resources or services and how to find them. Descriptions of your program, the work you do, or organization's accomplishments, your organization's contributions to community and overall suicide prevention efforts. examples of effective prevention or interventions that exist, again, in your community, and there are many others. Guidelines mean using an existing guidance or best practice that apply to the type of messaging you're creating. We've talked a lot about don'ts. The guidelines is where we talk about the do's. List of various existing resources. On the guidelines, use those that apply to your message. Categories include goals, such as reduction in prejudice and stereotypes, channels, such as social media, populations, such as LGBT populations. It's not meant to be comprehensive, just some key resources in various areas. As you go through the planning steps, check the guidelines periodically for resources. For example, if your plan includes using a video, you can consult the OAS criteria for educational videos on youth suicide. Again, this is where you can go for the do's. If you're a suicide, loss, or attempt survivor planning to tell your story to the public, you can refer to special considerations for telling your own story, best practices for presentation by suicide, loss, and suicide attempt survivors. Again, here's a list of what you can do. If you're developing messages part of a school postvention effort, there's resources that address that topic as well on the website. Again, more about what you can do. We encourage you to go to suicidepreventionmessaging.org to take a look at other resources available. Again, it's a great resource. It's full of things you can do, how to move forward with suicide prevention messaging in your community, in your day-to-day work. And now, it's my opportunity to turn it over to Linda Langford, who has played a very influential role in developing the framework. I think she refers to herself as the cat herder, and that just might make me a cat. So Linda, thank you for all your great work on the framework.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. I just wanted to really say thank you to Mark for his leadership throughout this process, and just say a word about the process. As with all Action Alliance efforts, a lot of different people and organizations worked to develop the framework and gave input and feedback along the way. So the Public Awareness and Education Task Force co-leads for the development of this resource were Mark Weber, who you just heard from HHS, Jack Benson from Rheingold, and Brian Dyack from Entertainment Industries Council. There are many other organizations represented on the Public Awareness and Education Task Force. You can see the full list on the Action Alliance website, including Facebook, the National Association of Broadcasters, Student Veterans of America. We had an expert panel that had a large cross-section of stakeholders, practitioners, experts in health communications, researchers. Lots of different suicide prevention organizations were consulted at many points throughout, and then other Action Alliance task forces, including the Attempt Survivor Task Force, Survivors of Suicide Loss Task Force, Faith Communities Task Force, and the American Indian Alaska Native Task Force. So there's more information on the website about that, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the extent of involvement in developing this resource. So I'm going to just take a minute to kind of hit some of the highlights, kind of pull together what Mark told you about, and help transition to the next piece that April will do. So as you start thinking about Suicide Prevention Month, the idea of the framework is not that we pick out one of these components of the framework and use that. It's really that these are 4 different lenses to be using kind of simultaneously, to be thinking through when you're developing messaging. So the strategy piece is really critical because that's where we get more focused on the messages. And it's that kind of focus on the audience, the call to action, the goals that Mark described that really, that research tells us make messages more effective. Avoiding the don'ts is important. Thinking about how am I contributing to a kind of prevention message, an overall prevention message that just lets the world know that there's good work going on, that people do get help. Just whatever version of that works for your audience and for your goal. And then am I taking advantage of the guidelines that are out there? Some are suicide specific and some are just sort of general the CDC social media toolkit, for example. Those resources exist, and we wanted to kind of pull them together so everybody could use them. Next slide. So as you think about your suicide prevention messaging, Suicide Prevention Month messaging, all of you are doing really important work, and I saw when you were talking about where you were from and some of the messaging that you're doing, you're in different contexts. You're from states, you're from localities, you're from college campuses, you're working in different contexts such as serving different populations. There's an array of different audiences that you could serve, such as parents or legislators, people in distress, adults who you want to interact with youth in distress. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all message that we could just give you and say, here's the message to use for all those different contexts and audiences. And it's really important that all of us are doing the work in our own context, and that your messaging is kind of aligned with what you're working on. So for your Suicide Prevention Month messaging, this is a good time to start thinking about how can what we do during Suicide Prevention Month really complement what we're already doing and our broader goals and the audiences we're already reaching, and what communications objectives, what might make sense, and are there specific audiences we want to hone in on for Suicide Prevention Month? What's our call to action? Is it the same call to action that we're usually using? Are we going to do something a little bit different for Suicide Prevention Month? Is our content safe and kind of supportive of prevention goals? And what's the version of the positive that we want to tell? So somebody asked, is it when some people can't talk about this, how do we talk about successes? And I think that's a great question. There always are some people who are talking about it. So let's talk about the people who are talking about it and what that looks like. That's always an option, because that helps other people to see this is how they could talk about it too. And then it's always important to be getting feedback on the messages from the people who you're trying to reach and influence. A lot of times, we're not the target audience that we're trying to reach, and so it's really helpful to get that feedback and to be thinking in advance, how can we make sure to get some feedback before Suicide Prevention Month? So although there's not a one-size-fits-all message that you all can use, there are some areas of alignment that many people are doing some version of messaging about that area, and April's going to talk about that in a moment. So I'll turn it back to you, Kim and Avery.
Thank you so much, Linda. This is Avery. And another question that came up, which I think relates some to positive narrative, maybe to other parts of the framework also. Someone mentioned that they work with veterans as a specific population, and they expressed the tension between, kind of raising awareness of the issue with that population and versus having a positive narrative, and maybe some of that is intention. So can we speak a little bit about specifically maybe special populations? Veterans might be one, LGBTQ might be others, high-risk groups especially, how the framework might speak to that tension.
Yep, absolutely. So the framework and the idea of positive narrative is not to say that we're not going to talk about suicide as a problem or talk about the problem of suicide. It's that we're going to also include ways that people can be involved in prevention or examples of where prevention actually worked. And so at the same time, you can talk about high-risk populations. This is a high-risk population for suicide. How can the audience that you're communicating to, what are you going to ask them to do to be involved in addressing that? And what would that look like, for example, if veterans, what's the range of places veterans do get support or help? There's not just one way to get support and help, so what resources are available? So I think it's really thinking about, if our aim is to help veterans find resources and support, how can we include something about what that looks like when it works? And the website, the campaign that I would refer you to is maketheconnection.net, which is actual veterans talking about times that they've struggled and kind of what helped them get through those struggles, those times of struggle. And there's lots of other information too, but that's a great example of it's not ignoring the problem, but it's helping people see, okay, here are some pathways. I hope that helps.
Yeah,
Thanks
so much, Linda. If I'm hearing you correctly, really, then it's really thinking about each piece of the framework to think about how to craft the best message. So
right. So what's your strategy, and then how does positive narrative kind of how do we help the public envision what prevention can look like around that strategy?
Exactly. Thanks so much, Linda. Sure. Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
And that was a great question. Thank you so much for the person who asked that. And again, we encourage you to use the chat function. Any questions you have, thoughts you want to share, please type that into the chat. And on the next slide, what I want to mention is we have something called the Messenger. It is a new tool the Action Alliance developed, and it's designed to highlight the framework for successful messaging, which you just heard Linda and Mark talk about. And it provides tips for how to best use the framework. And you can view past issues or sign up to receive future issues by going to suicidepreventionmessenger.org. And now that we covered the framework for successful messaging that's available to you to create effective messaging, we now want to discuss our plans for Suicide Prevention Month in September. So let me turn it over to April.
Oh, I'm so glad to be talking to you all. And first of all, I just want to give a shout out to all the folks in the chat box. What an engaged group of folks that you are. Just really quick, Kim, did you want me to sort of briefly go over what a postvention is, Kim or Avery?
Yeah, I've been seeing that in the chat a lot. Of people have asked a few questions about what postvention is. So I think that'd be great. Thanks, April.
So before we launch into Suicide Prevention Month, I know that people have different sort of levels of familiarity with the suicide prevention realm, and postvention is the opposite. When somebody dies by suicide, what they leave are survivors, and those folks have really particular needs and may have their own mental health needs. And so postvention is helping survivors of suicide with coping with the suicide loss, and also doing what we can to take care of their health and well-being, because we know that people who survived a suicide may be at more risk of suicide themselves, and so we're always thinking of that. And if I can get maybe Kim or Avery or someone to maybe post some resources, that sort of some links in the chat about more about postvention, hopefully that will help you all out. I want to talk a little bit about Suicide Prevention Month and what is so important about suicide prevention messaging. So there is this 1 month a year, for those, some of you may know and some of you may not, where all across the world people are going to be, launching messaging about suicide and suicide prevention, and that's September, which is Suicide Prevention Month. And when we're doing messaging during that month, have I hit the wrong arrow? Am I on the wrong slide? I'm so sorry. But when we're doing messaging about that month, we want to be really thinking about having aligned, powerful messaging. A lot of people are going to be doing a lot of things. So what we want to do is think about our messaging during that month. We want to encourage messaging that is effective because it promotes resiliency. I'm not sure how we're flying through slides. My apologies. But we want to be thinking about things that encourage help-seeking, things that publicize success, things that educate the public, and especially things that inspire people to act. So as people who are national leaders in the suicide prevention field know, we've been doing a lot of messaging in the past about awareness, but we're starting to get a lot of feedback from the public that they want to know what to do. So as you're going into planning your messaging for Suicide Prevention Month, we hope that you're especially thinking about how your messaging inspires people to take action in the service of preventing suicide. I'm going to go ahead and hit and advance the slide. So Suicide Prevention Month is this wonderful opportunity to promote that everyone has a role in preventing suicide, and for us to align as a field. And I know that for many people who are on the chat today, they feel that they are professional in mental health or specifically in suicide prevention. And so that is a wonderful chance for us to get together on that. And it's also a chance for us to broadcast our messaging in a way that might bring new partners to the table. There may be people who are natural partners in suicide prevention messaging that we see are interested in our messaging and might broadcast that with us. And so we believe that, because suicide is a major public health issue, that it affects so many people. And we want to really encourage people to message not just with, not just us speaking to ourselves, but that we really bring partners to the table. We have a lot of stakeholders when it comes to suicide prevention. That being said, there are some campaigns that are in the works. So and we just listed a few on this slide. So for example, we have the Be the One to campaigns from the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or the Be There campaigns with the Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense. We have things like Take 5 to Save Lives, and also World Suicide Prevention Day. So there's a specific day that happens all across the world. And you'll notice that these different organizations all have different campaigns that they're doing. As a matter of fact, I bet some of the folks who are here at our chat probably are working on campaigns or working on media and messaging for that month themselves. And so, I would think it would be awesome if you have a minute in that chat box to share with us some of the things that your organization or that you're planning on doing for Suicide Prevention Month. Because not only do we have official organizations, but some of you just may be journalists or who might be covering things during that month. Some of you may be bloggers or people who are stakeholders in suicide prevention that are going to be planning your own unique content during that month. And we want to think about, what are we doing? So not only do we want our messaging to be effective and promote action and follow all these wonderful guidelines, but additionally, together, we can have a much bigger impact. So one of the things that we need to know is that when it comes to media and messaging, if you're just working yourself in a silo, messaging to your small audience, you might only have a constrained impact. It might be important, but it might be limited to your channel or your network or your audience reach. But together, we can have a really big impact. And so one of the things that members of the Action Alliance and the Changing the Conversation work group have been talking about is how we could be working collaboratively in the month of December to make a bigger splash. So we want to think about how could we be connecting the messaging that you're doing with other messaging produced by other people in this field during this month. In a lot of ways, we might have shared audiences. So people who are interested in veterans might also be interested in active duty soldiers, might also be interested in survivors, in talking about recovery, might also be interested in folks who are talking about intervention and who might be talking about how do we message safely during this month, because we may have bloggers who are veterans who might want to know how to make their messaging better. And all of these are sort of related or connected messengers, and we want to make sure and connect folks. So think about how we could be putting the pieces together, right? We want to align our efforts, and how might we do that? So first of all, I want you to know that there are going to be some existing campaigns, and I hope that you're going to be following them. So look at the campaigns for World Suicide Prevention Day by the IASP, Taking a Minute to Change a Life. Are you following them? Will you be looking at their message? Make sure, if your organization is following them, consider sharing their message on Facebook or consider retweeting their message. We'll talk about that, or putting it out in your e-blast or mentioning it in your article. Be the One to 5 Action Steps in Suicide Prevention is being promoted by the Lifeline, and they're going to have all sorts of really great content. Once again, your organization can share that content. Be there for a veteran or be there for a service member. This is going to be beautiful. I happen to know, although I'm not speaking on behalf of Veterans Affairs, I do work there, and I know they've got some great messaging planned. If you know that part of your target audience is veterans, consider sharing their messaging. Or Take 5 to Share Lives. Take 5 Action Steps to Save Lives, and how you can support a friend. These are wonderful campaigns that are going on, and they're definitely going to be going on during September. So you can include this messaging in your own messaging and in your own channel. And we're going to talk about ways that you can be doing that. Just going to forward that slide. So we want to know that there are many efforts going on. We want you to know about many efforts that are going on. If you are here, part of the benefits of being a part of this webinar is you're sort of on the inside track about messaging that we know is coming out. We want you to feel included. Know that these messages intentionally and planfully, because people that work at these different organizations communicate and are great colleagues, they've intentionally created one common component in all of these messaging campaigns. They're talking about the concept of being there for others who are struggling or who are in crisis. And this is something for you to know, so that if you notice that there's a theme or these messages have sort of a unified sort of call to action, that was intentional. And we want to include you in that as well. So we want you to know that based on some important sort of target audience research that have been done, we found that almost 50% of Americans have identified barriers that stop them from trying to help somebody at risk for suicide. And that's significant, that we have people who want to help and something gets in the way. And some of the things that they identified are things that fear that they might do something or say something to make things worse rather than better. And, you know, if you're like me and you love people who have attempted suicide and recovery, or if you've survived a suicide loss, or if you have someone near you who's survived a suicide loss, you might not know what to say, and you might be really caring and thoughtful and just feel a little bit like, I love some guidance on what's the thing that I can do that's helpful. And so we're trying to help provide that with some of these campaigns, right? Or maybe you don't know how to help somebody or how to find help. You know, I find this really, really interesting. I work in suicide prevention, and I help people in crisis, and it's amazing to me how many of my friends, you know, message me and say, I care about this person in crisis, tell me what to do. And so what I want you to know is that these messaging campaigns are really trying to fill this public health messaging gap, and they're trying to make sure that we have a loud, aligned voice about these are the ways that you can help someone in crisis, or these are some things that you can do if you care about helping. Our goal is to elevate awareness about ways that we can be there for someone who's struggling or in crisis. So not just to let people know that suicide is an issue and to bring it out of the darkness, but then give people clear, concrete ways that they can take action, just like we know about CPR, first aid, or just like during flu season, we remind people to wash their hands and consider talking with their doctor about a vaccination, right? We want to let people know suicide is a common public health issue, and here are some things that you can do. So here we go. This is a wonderful, simple equation. The public reports not knowing what to do, and so we have these existing campaigns that highlight what the public can do, and this gives us as messengers an opportunity to align our efforts to amplify the importance of being there for someone who's struggling or in crisis, and give them ideas about simple actions that can make a difference. So the Action Alliance and its partners are going to come together during a week in September to make the public aware of simple steps. And this is when. So, you know, if you're all sitting in the webinar and you've got your phones out or you've got your computers on, put this on your calendar. Suicide Prevention Week is September 11th through 16th. This is a target date. We're even giving you actionable steps, right? And we're going to be increasing national public awareness about simple actions that people can do to prevent suicide and save lives. And we're really going to be focusing messaging during this week. So if you're a messenger on this, we hope you'll join us. And here's some things that you can do to join us. So first of all, the Action Alliance is coordinating a national thunderclap the week of September 11th, and they're also doing other social media promotion. We hope you'll join us. You can promote a shared hashtag. It's the National Suicide Prevention Week, hashtag NSPW. And this hashtag, lean in. Just a minute, everybody. I know you're listening. This hashtag has been used in the past. It has some pretty good traffic. We want to really drive traffic. We want for all of us to be using the same tag so that when people see your messaging, they're also seeing your colleagues' messaging. And with a really large volume of messaging, we increase the chance that the messaging is going to be seen and heard. So please promote this hashtag on your social media channels. Please do tag your media content with NSPW. Let people know where they can find a lot of messaging about suicide prevention that week. We're going to be disseminating existing materials that promote shared messaging about being there for others. If you've got messaging, use that tag. Promote each other's messaging. This is where a rising tide raises all boats, right? So if you're promoting others and they're promoting you, that message just gets amplified. And then build out an online presence that directs traffic to one of the existing campaigns and their existing messages that are talking about how to support someone in need. So if you're doing your messaging, let people know there's more messaging over here. If this is important to you, here's where you can get more resources. If you're doing a journalism piece, because that is a week that we're really talking about that issue, let people know that these are where they can read more about it. Consider tagging your messages. This isn't a new campaign. This is not even newly created messaging, and this is not a duplication of efforts. These organizations, and we're inviting you, are talking about a shared and collaborative concept. They're aligning their campaign efforts, and they're unifying our field so that all of our individual efforts count more than any of them would have counted separately. Save the date. I love talking about save the dates, right? So these are things you can do. Join with us September 11 through 16 to promote the importance of being there for others and highlight people's actions aimed at helping those who are struggling in crisis. To stay involved and learn more, here's what I want you to do. You've got your computer out, put this on your browser and save it, right? www.actionallianceforsuicideprevention.org. Everybody open a little browser tab, pop this in, bookmark this website. Send yourself an email, make a note. If you want to learn more and you want to be involved, you've still got a couple months to find out more and do that. Go to www.actionallianceforsuicideprevention.org. Bookmark it, visit it, email it to your colleagues. Consider aligning with these national efforts. Promote the messages on the shared theme in newsletters, social media, blog posts, hashtags, e-blasts, whatever works for you. Promote the shared hashtag, join the Thunderclap campaign, and visit and promote the shared effort website that's going to be on Action Alliance's website. That website that I just asked you to bookmark, we're going to be telling you more. So go there for information. It's coming soon. We're super excited. This is the point where we start to take questions. So I'm going to turn this back over to Avery and Kim. I'm so excited that you've been with us today.
Thank you so much, April. And so as we go into this next section, I encourage you to type questions that you have for the presenters, not just for this last section, but for the entirety of the presentation. I know some of you have been doing that, so I've been capturing those, which is awesome. And we'll have some of the presenters answer some of those questions here in a moment. Before we move on, I do have a few questions, though, specific, April, to your part of the presentation. So sure, several folks asked, and I think you kind of talked about it broadly, but what is a thunderclap? Can you define what a thunderclap is for us?
So this is one of those great social media tools that we've seen in the last couple of years. Thunderclap is a way that people can amplify messaging. You sign up, and basically it allows Action Alliance messaging or related campaign messaging to go out. You say, I give them permission to post the messages on my Facebook or my Twitter, and it allows for really, really broad messaging. You see Thunderclap often used with non-for-profits who are doing advocacy, much like we're doing public health advocacy during the week of National Suicide Prevention, right? And so this is going to be a way that you can, with very, very little work, sign up to let some of this content come out in your feeds. And we encourage you to look that over and sign up in advance of Suicide Prevention Week.
Great. Thank you so much,
Does that
April.
help? Oh, wonderful. Good.
It does. I think so, yeah. And if folks, if you have additional questions about kind of that concept, please feel free to continue putting those in the chat box. Also, as part of your presentation, you asked for folks to mention a couple examples of things they were doing. So I wanted to go back and mention that because there were some really great examples in the chat. I think some that even demonstrate some of this, what we're hoping for, right, which is collaboration with these themes and tailoring it to a specific audience. So For instance, Caroline mentioned the Navy has a campaign, which is every sailor every day, and they're collaborating with Be There to follow their messaging practices and incorporate that kind of Be There theme. So that's a great example of collaborating with these larger themes, but tailoring it to an audience. We also have another example from Christy, which is working with the Be the One Too and tailoring it for the construction industry. So figuring out how to tailor that and message specifically to that audience. And then one of our participants from Canada talked about how they've learned some language from the First Nations community there to use the word hope, help, and healing instead of maybe some of the other more clinical terms that we use. So listening to your audience, consulting with them is part of the strategy. I think that reflects some of the intent with the framework too. So some really great examples. And there were a lot of other examples, folks doing so many different things, which is really, really exciting. So thank you all for sharing all of those different activities that you're doing. And any reflections on kind of the activities that I shared or others, April or the other presenters, before we move into other questions?
You know, I'm getting a chance to look through, and I have to confess everything was moving so fast I couldn't pay attention, present, and read the chat box, which is exciting that so much is happening. So I've noticed that people are wondering about it, if National Suicide Prevention Week is only in the U.S., and I believe so, but lots of people join in. People are having discussions about 13 reasons why, and whether or not it's an appropriate message, things like that. We know things like that are complicated, and I know people are trying to decide what kind of messaging is best for their audience. Just do remember that you know your audience well, and in my mind, that the framework is a way, like when you, either as an individual messenger, are really giving serious thought to the quality of your messaging, or if you're giving serious thought to how much should I recommend somebody watch 13 Reasons Why, it's giving you a framework or a way to sort of evaluate the quality of what you're looking at and discuss it with your stakeholders or your organization. And remember, you're being strategic. You're doing what's in the best interest of your organization and the best interest of the community that you serve. And so what may be really, really good for the Navy might not be as appropriate, for example, for youth in a school who are 11 years old. You will do different kinds of messaging, but the idea of what makes a quality message, the sort of the secret sauce, may be relatively the same. And I just wanted to respond to a couple of those questions. I hope that's okay, Avery.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for jumping in. Another great example of tailoring that I would like to share with you all from the perspective of the National Action Alliance is our Faith Task Force, which focuses on suicide prevention in faith communities, is also thinking about how to incorporate all of these themes, especially the thought of Be There, into a campaign calling faith communities across the weekend of September 9th, 8th, 9th, and 10th to do a day of prayer in their faith community, focused on being there for people who are individuals who struggle with suicide. So it's another way, another community that's focusing with a specific audience, tailoring that, but again, following underneath this broad theme. So another great example. So just encouragement to continue typing in questions that you might have for the presenters. Again, these can be questions that are very broad. It doesn't have to be questions specific to this last part of the presentation, but the entirety of the presentation about the framework more broadly, or something specific perhaps about Suicide Prevention Month. One of the questions, which I think, Linda, this might be a good question for you to answer, had to do with evaluation of the messaging guidelines and examples perhaps of evaluation of guidelines, perhaps how the evaluation that is available led to the guidelines that we have. So can you speak a moment about evaluation?
Sure. This is an area where we definitely need more research, but there are some reviews out there of mental health literacy campaigns and suicide prevention-related campaigns. And in general, the results are pretty similar to what you find from outside suicide prevention, that there are a lot of changes that messaging alone is going to have trouble making. And so that's one of the recommendations, that to kind of combine messaging with other components and other trainings and services and other initiatives that you're doing is because that kind of amplifies it enough to maybe have more of an impact than you might see otherwise. So there are some relatively simple messages where there's some pretty decent evidence that if you share the lifeline number, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number or crisis number with people, that calls will go up to the lifeline. So we don't know exactly if we're reaching the people who most need, who most need that number or need to be calling, but we do, so there are some relatively simple messages that we know do get through. But if we're trying for more complex changes, then probably a combination of efforts is more likely to result in change. And so I'll just give somebody was asking, a couple people in the chat were asking about what are best practices for messaging to school-age children or youth. And so again, I would say what's the strategy, sort of what are your overall programmatic goals, and then how can you make messaging be supportive of that? So Sources of Strength is a school-based program, sometimes it's in communities, that promotes a series of different strengths and focuses on identifying trusted adults. And there are a number of efforts. There's a peer leader group that does that. There are institutional level policies and procedures, et cetera. But they really focus on making sure that the messaging is promoting the strengths, that are the sources of strength, and amplifying the idea of trusted adults. So that's where you can really think about what it is that you're trying to accomplish and make sure that the messaging is supportive of that. And there are programs like Sources of Strength that have found successful results. So that's where we get those recommendations about kind of thinking about messaging in combination with other efforts.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda, for answering those questions for us. Mark, maybe you can answer this question. One individual asked around kind of timing, since we know we have a focus in September, if the messaging is diluted if we start prior to September. So maybe if you could share some thoughts around that.
I would say not at all. Any safe, positive messaging about what things can do, what people can do between now and National Suicide Prevention Week contributes to the overall message. And, just because there's a week doesn't mean, we don't have the rest of the year to be doing this work. And I noticed, some of the other questions were about how can we join existing efforts. And, again, I think I mentioned earlier, targeting specific audiences. I would again refer everybody right to the suicidepreventionmessaging.org website. There are amazing resources on there about guidelines of how to reach audiences and best practices from others. And then again, another resource that the suicidepreventionmessages.org will get you to is the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. Many lists of best practices for specific audiences, specific topics. For example, I see folks are asking about 13 reasons. There's a paper on talking about 13 reasons why on the Resource Center. So this is a year-long effort, and what is great about Suicide Prevention Week, it gives us an opportunity to all really come together and show the force across the country working to prevent suicide.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And April, did you maybe have some perspective on that as well?
So I think this is great that people are asking questions about messaging and marketing. So there's the piece where Action Alliance and where the people who are presenting to you today are really expert about the aspects of how suicide prevention messaging can be safe and effective. But there are going to be things about media and messaging that are going to be more general, things like timing and do we want to dilute the message or can we do it in advance? If we do it in advance, will we lose momentum? And do remember that there are general media and marketing strategies that depend on your audience or that just sort of depend on the nature of your messaging. Like I know someone also in the chat mentioned Facebook. How do we deal with Facebook's algorithm? So those are going to be questions about media messaging that you would want to take to communications expert. So while we would want the framework to really, help refine the suicide prevention specific aspects of your messaging, don't forget that if you want your messaging to be very effective, you also want to talk to people who are just generally expert at communications and messaging and marketing, because Facebook and Twitter are here today, but it may be another platform tomorrow, or the newsletter may work now, but it may be something else later, and you want to talk with experts who really understand those unique individual things. Timing issues in certain platforms may be handled one way, and may be handled another in another way. Just please do continue to consult with communications experts. Just let them know about this framework, or let them know about these guidelines so that they can incorporate that into their plans.
Great, thank you, April. And another thing too, I see a lot of you are chatting resources to the group, which is really great. It's beautiful to see this community of folks that have their hands on a lot of different links and resources. And there's a lot of questions about specific resources. So I think we're trying to capture those, and then in the email that we send you after this event, we'll make sure to include some resources and links to places where you can go for resources in addition to the framework that's going to answer some of these specific questions. So if you're not seeing a link that someone's providing that answers your specific need, and I think there are a few that have to do pretty broadly with planning or postvention, for instance, we'll make sure to include some of those links as well. There was another great question. I think it's come up multiple times, the importance of having folks with lived experience as part of that positive narrative. And so one individual asked, what's the best way to recruit folks who can share those stories, those positive personal stories, and what are some resources about that? Linda, is that something maybe you want to speak to?
Sure. So I think it's really important to engage people with lived experience at all, all steps along the way. So we definitely want to be showing actual examples of messages in media to members of the target audience and to people with lived experience to make sure, just to get their feedback and take on it. But even going back to at the very beginning, having people around the table in the strategy discussions can really help you, kind of not go down a pathway that you later decide is kind of not as productive as you'd like. So how to find people, I would say there's, many of you have contacts with people with lived experience in the course of your work. So, just ask people to be on the lookout for people who are expressing an interest in becoming engaged in the work. If that's not what your organization does, I would say this is a great place for partnerships, to reach out to some of the other partners in your area or who are also work with your audience, and to just ask, are there people that have lived experience and might be interested in working with us on some initiatives, and think about, compensating people for their time as well, because there's a lot of the work that happens as volunteers, but if we're going to ask a lot of people, we may want to go beyond a volunteer arrangement.
Great, thank you for those thoughts, Linda. Another question which has come up a couple different times, and this one is a little bit more specific rather than broad, but is around images used to kind of set the tone for Suicide Prevention Month or suicide prevention activities in general. So one individual asked if there are certain types of images that should be avoided that we might commonly see as part of posters and other things that are designed around suicide prevention. And another individual kind of asked a little different nuance if it's okay for it not to be somber, because so many times it is. So can we talk a little bit about the way that the framework might help us to wrestle with that question?
Oh, that is a great question. I'm sorry. You want to go ahead, Linda?
You go, April.
I was going to say, for every poster and every image, make it a head clutcher if you can. All those pictures, right, where everybody's got their hand on their forehead like they have a headache, and that's how we depict all mental illness messaging, except for I'm sort of rolling my eyes a little bit. We want to think about images about self-harm and about means. So we definitely, these are images that I would not want to use. These are images that I think sort of, and when we talk about the framework and we talk about safety, there are some images that I think are just sort of blatantly not safe. And then there's a piece of it that's effective. There are images that are really contextually based, and so you might consider your audience when you're thinking about images to use. And of course, I think there are really great times when you're doing suicide prevention messaging that you absolutely do want to use more kittens, when on the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline's website, the image of the kitten playing on their sort of distractions gifts sort of area is actually one of their most visited pages. And so you want to think about effectiveness and what's helping you get to your strategy or get to your goal. And you also want to think about things like safety. Linda, what would you say?
Yeah, I think what you just said is great, April. I think that there's definitely a tension there sometimes because we don't want to use images that are sort of stereotyping or stigmatizing. And at the same time, you don't want to use images. You want people who need the message, you want it to get their attention. So at one point I was working on a campaign and we said, we know we don't want to use the head clutchers, but if we put everybody, who's on a poster with a smile, does that get people who aren't feeling smiley to look at these messages? So we kind of had to come to a place where the expressions on the faces were a little bit more serious, but not necessarily stereotyping or stigmatizing, what struggling might look like. The sources of strength messages that I just showed you are very strength-based, and so they would use the kinds of images and colors that would be more along the lines of what they're going for. The other thing I would say is make sure that the images match your messages. So if the point of the message is to say that that people can get help from their friends, show two people together in a picture interacting instead of one person, but saying they can get help from their friends. So a lot of times I feel kind of a lack of alignment between the images and the message, and so that's another way to think about it. But there's no kind of do use these colors always, don't use these colors always. That's why we're going to test with audiences and make sure that we're kind of getting all the elements right.
And I'm even thinking of like Teen Crisis Line in Arizona, like where they even sort of A/B tested items. So like items where they were depicting sports heroes and using suicide prevention messaging versus puppies and kittens. And they found for teenage boys, they actually prefer the puppies and kittens. Like you may use the things that work, bottom line, right?
Thank you both for those replies. I think that's really helpful and a pretty common question that a lot of folks I think are wrestling with. So thank you for the folks that chatted that in. That's great. One more question, and this question is for Mark. What an individual asked, what best practices are there for pitching stories to local media? So they have all this great information now. They know that they want to help their local media craft a story that is positive, that follows these messaging guidelines. Where do they start? How can they pitch a story to their local media and get them involved?
A couple of quick things. Number one, pick up the phone and reach out to reporters who you have covered the topic in the past. And you started out about talking about the things that are happening in the community to prevent suicide. You let them know about resources that are available. And whenever I've talked with reporters about suicide prevention and reporting on, I've always sent them a copy of the media guidelines. And I said, and I'm like, as really appreciate your past work and writing on the topic of suicide prevention, suicide in the community. Here's some guidelines that have been developed to help you as you work in the future on this topic. I almost every time, it's been a little while since I was doing that pitching kind of work, but almost every time the reporters I talked with were incredibly grateful for the media guidelines and said, I had no idea. I really appreciate this information. Thank you very much. And so, it was a two-part approach. Number one, pitching resources available, upcoming information, Suicide Prevention Awareness Week, and using the opportunity to promote the guidelines.
Great, thank you, Mark. And just one more question. An individual asked about kind of the promotion, and April, I think this one might be for you, the promotion of the crisis text line versus the lifeline. And one individual shared they seem to see that more folks promote the lifeline in general over the crisis text line. So any thoughts about that?
So once again, I'm always going to say, who is your audience and what is your strategy? I'm so lucky that I sit, that I have relationships with both of those organizations. If you're working with teams a lot and the crisis text line is something that really resonates well with your audience, you might share how to text them. If you find that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is going to work really, really well with your audience, you might reference them. I know many people, when they're doing media on this, they reference both. So, I mean, you just want to think about your audience's needs and send them resources that you know are going to resonate with them. And if you don't know, you might ask some people in your audience how, what resonates for them and what do they think about sharing both.
Great. Thank you so much, April. And that'll bring this question and answer section to a close. Thank you all so much for all of the energy you brought to this discussion. I think this is one of the most active question and answer sections I've seen in a webinar like this, so thank you so much. I know that we didn't get to necessarily specifically answer everyone's questions, but we're capturing those, and we're going to find a way to make sure if there's specific resources that you need that we can provide those as much as possible. So again, thank you so much for all those questions that you brought throughout the conversation, and especially here to the end. And Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Avery, and thank you to Linda and April and Mark. And before we wrap up today's webinar, I just want to touch on a few things. We hope, most importantly, you found the information that you heard today, that it was useful, and not only useful in September when you're messaging during Suicide Prevention Month, but useful well into the future. And if questions come up, say next month, in September, maybe next year, email us. We want to help. My email address is on the screen here, ktorgerson@edc.org. And as I mentioned, we recorded today's webinar, and it will be available on the Action Alliance's website, Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention.